Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is episode 12 of CultureCast. If you haven't tuned into us before, we're eXp Realty's official diversity, equity, and inclusion podcast. And I'm your host, Cody Gilkison, the Senior Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here. Today, we have a very special episode. You may have noticed that we've gone from our normal bi-weekly cadence to do a weekly schedule. That's just so that we could fit in this one special episode we've been waiting for. And I'm pleased as punch to tell you that my guest here today is Gene Brake, and we're going to be talking about the AIDS epidemic. Welcome, Gene.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. So I grew up in the state of Texas, a challenging place to grow up as an LGBTQ citizen. Spent most of my life there. My father was a home contractor. And so it made perfect sense for me to get into the real estate industry. I spent 30 plus years in the customer service industry, if you will, working for Time Warner Cable, as well as Starbucks corporate headquarters in Seattle, Washington. My last non-real estate gig is I was the National Command Center Manager for the 2010 census.
Oh, that's wow.
So I am, in addition to all of my work world, I've been a public activist since probably the mid 80s. Became involved in the fight through the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, and attended the National March on Washington in 1987. And although I was a little baby activist prior to that, that cemented my resolve and came back to San Antonio, Texas to fight to make a difference.
Yeah, that's it. I grew up in Georgia, and I often think about, I live in a state in Illinois where I have certain protections as a queer person, but I always think about those that I left behind in Georgia and how we can improve our situation for everybody so that we don't leave behind those folks that live in rural areas and that sort of thing. So tell me about your personal experience during the onset of the AIDS crisis. Where were you living? What was that like when it first started coming out?
I moved to San Antonio, Texas in 1983 from Houston, Texas. So my experience really sort of overlapped both cities. And moving from Houston, Texas to San Antonio, Texas was eye-opening, but also I found a greater community that needed to get involved and to become activists. I think that many of us became activists not because we necessarily wanted to be carrying a banner in the front of any parade, but because we needed to create that parade that allowed others to carry that banner, and we had to all fight for every little thing at the beginning. Right. I got involved primarily to help raise funds against the fight, because in those early days, there was no federal funding, there was no state funding. If we needed to take care of our brothers who were dying, it had to come from us. And so no one was going to take care of us. We had to do it. From the time their diagnosis, whether it be we were helping pay their utility bills, or raising funds to feed them or keep a roof over their head by paying their rent. Sadly, to the very end, in many cases, funeral homes would not assist in their final arrangements. And so we would raise funds to pay for body bags, and we, in some cases, had to take shifts digging graves and placing our loved ones in graves. So it was a very dark time, and I think many people today don't really understand how terrible it really was in those days when it first came out.
Yeah, it's so true. And we've seen a lot of me being a millennial, we were pretty inundated when we first started seeing queer life on television and movies. It seemed like everything was about the AIDS epidemic. And I can tell you from what I've learned about the history of the movement and the history of the AIDS epidemic, that none of those really do it justice to the real horror. You talk about digging graves for friends that's pretty stark, right? We never
Pretty
never
stark.
see that in a movie. Yeah.
Yeah, you never see that in the movies, and just the sheer isolation of the time.
Mm.
I remember one of my good friends, Les. I went into a bar one day, had not seen him in a very long time, and could tell he was clearly sick. And because he was just so emaciated. And so I ran up to him and said, "Oh my gosh, Les, how have you been? It's so good to see you." And I gave him a big hug, and he just started crying. And it was like, What's wrong? He said, "You're the first person who's even touched me in months. People just stay away from me and avoid me." And I was like, well, that makes no sense whatsoever. It's not, that's, I can't catch it from hugging you.
Mm.
But there was a prevailing fear and paranoia generated by people who had a political axe to grind in many cases. But there was that fear expanded into our own community. So when you get so many mixed messages in the media, our own community, in many cases, we're just like, I don't know how to process this. I'm just going to be careful and just not ever touch anyone. So
Yeah.
it was a dark time for sure.
Yeah. I mean, and then we had a lot of heroes step up, during that time. A lot of folks that are going to be legendary to the topic of gay history for a long, long time. But one of the most polarizing figures, I think we all can agree, is Larry Kramer. And Kramer, his message of monogamy or abstinence being the only possible strategies for tackling the AIDS crisis was not well received by many in the LGBTQ community. How was it in Texas? How did people receive that message there?
So he was controversial for many reasons, not just that, but um, our community, especially in Texas, it tended to fall into the category of, if we're going to gain acceptance, we have to look like them, dress like them, act like them, and
Mm.
we can't be outrageous. The drag queens who were raising the funds to keep our brothers alive were ostracized too, because they were seen as, no, you're out there. You're really out there. We need to wear a tie. We need to. There was a movement to have these business communities. In San Antonio, we had something called the Alamo Business Council, and it was an invitation only, and you had to look a certain way. So it was in many ways. Larry Kramer was like, not about that at all. I'm going to get in your face and I'm going to make you feel what we are experiencing. And
Mm.
so he was very controversial, not just for the safe sex or no sex
Right.
mantra, but for the other reasons as well.
Right.
Was
He was
he
also was still it's funny to think when you look at history as a spectrum. I didn't live through the AIDS epidemic, but I've certainly done, you know, in the age of the internet, I'm happy to say that as an adult, I've been able to learn more about gay history that wasn't available to me as a kid, right? And you see these things broken down into segments and eras, and I don't think I've ever put together that same sort of Mattachine society sentiment of buttoned up business people that are fitting in
right?
was still that prevalent in the 80s, and that could be a reason that people sort of raged against Kramer's message. That's
Well, it persisted long past the 80s. I mean,
mm,
there was a time in the 90s that in Houston, Texas, one of the most out and proud cities out there, and certainly today, one of the leaders in the fight for acceptance and everyone belongs. There was a time when the organizers of the Pride Parade said, okay, this year we are not going to allow drag queens. We are not going to allow men in leather. We are going to have a dress code for everyone participates on a float or anything. And that was not just in Houston, but that same thought has raised its ugly head depending on the organizing committee in many cities throughout the country. And we rightfully fought back then to that. And so today, when I see the anti-drag movement of the right, it's like, well, we fought this before and we fought to accept it. and we fought for, we need to be who we are. And absolutely, drag queens were on the forefront of everything, every right that we have fought for. I'm very involved in a drag organization that has, the Imperial Court International Court System that was founded by Jose Sarria, the first out candidate for public office. And he was all about standing up, coming out of the closet, standing up for your rights and fighting back. And he was all about, we need to unite. And he was doing this in the late 50s and early 60s. And so you have to understand that the fight has been going on for many years, and certainly going on long before Stonewall. But yes, Larry Kramer was controversial, and even today he is quite controversial amongst men of my generation, because some people just didn't understand. And I have long since espoused his, act up sort of mentality. I'm going to get in your face if you don't like it.
That's
to make my point.
For all the controversy, there is that something that I think we all can take from his no fear in your face, never back down spirit. I love that. And seeing, like I said, the heroes that emerged from this, and, through organizations like ACT UP and doing things like going out into Times Square and playing dead on the ground, that's a hell of a twist on the old sit-in, and then you mentioned working for the Names Project with the AIDS quilt. Can you tell us more about your work there and how you got involved?
So I got involved. Well, the first Names Project display was in 1987 at the March on Washington. And so I saw it there and was so moved by it, and saw how moving it was and the power of that visualization. Think back, the Names Project, it was the brainchild of Cleve Jones, who lives outside San Francisco now. And so it was his brainchild, and it grew out of a protest where people had written the names of people they had lost to AIDS and taped them to a wall. And he looked at them and saw this was like a big patchwork quilt. And so the size of those panels, which was 3 feet by 6 feet, was to give a visualization of the approximation of a grave. And so it was very moving. So myself and a couple of others who had traveled to Washington, D.C. from San Antonio, Texas, came back to San Antonio, started a Names Project chapter, began panel making workshop where loved ones would come in with a box of items that belonged to their son or brother or spouse, and help them process their grief and create quilt panels to memorialize their loved one. And that was extremely profoundly cathartic for them to process, to work through their grief. But it gave us a glimpse into their lives. And so it helped us create that memorial. So I was very involved in that, and then traveled back to Washington, D.C. in 1989 as a volunteer when we were on the Ellipse, the first time we were on the Washington Mall. And then we hosted a Names Project display in San Antonio in June, Father's Day weekend of June 1990. That was my involvement through the Names Project, for sure.
That's amazing. You got to touch a piece of history, and that's pretty profound. I think the AIDS quilt is maybe, the most lasting symbol of the AIDS epidemic that still exists and you can still see today. And it's something that's part of that. If folks haven't seen the Pride History Experience in eXp World, that's something that I created and cultivated with the Pride Network. That's going to be back in 2024. We're moving it into frame, and we're going to make a big section about the AIDS quilt that is going to be pretty cool. And maybe we'll even feature this episode of the podcast there, since we've got
maybe who knows?
Yeah, maybe who knows. So during this epidemic, there was a major public perception that in some ways it kind of still exists today, that gay men deserved the AIDS epidemic. That kind of rhetoric really impacted the general public's already negative views of the queer community, and that kind of negativity still lingers from that epidemic today. What was it like living when that public perception started to happen, that this was a form of punishment?
Well, a couple of things on that. So first of all, the perception is a political, but turned into a political tool. And so it has been resurrected in one way or the other, whether it be, the most recent resurrection of that is on trans individuals. And so it was a perception first that grew out of fear, the unknown, that it is this airborne, and so there was a logic between caution and fear initially. But once the facts became available, it turned, rather than being based on reality, and it turned into a political motivation. And unfortunately, leveraged by those who didn't care about how it impacted individuals' lives. They were seeking public office, or they were promoting people in a particular ideology. So you have to, homes. So for example, some of the travails of Ryan White. Ryan White lived in a small community. He developed it from a blood transfusion, and they had to move because they would have people. People were showing up at their door. Throughout this time frame, the fear and hysteria driven by the political bent to create a narrative around those people, the othering of our community, if you will, expanded. And the vitriol was to the point where homes were burned and people had to leave their communities. And so as some of the things that are happening today, were happening there, and the roots of what's happening today began then when the political machine grabbed on to what they saw was the initial fear and unknown.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, I came out of the closet when I was 15, to my mom, to friends, but I didn't come out to my dad until I was 19. And I had been, living a gay life. I went to college when I was 17, and I could not have been more out of the closet and wild in those, first couple of years. And I finally came out to my dad. I'll never forget, he said to me, I just feel bad for you. I feel sorry for you because you're going to get AIDS and you're going to go to hell. And that's, the go to hell thing is another issue, but that was the perception in the South, was that if you are gay and you aren't in this particular brand of gay that is sort of unique to the American South, where I have admitted that I'm gay, but I go to church and I don't sleep with anyone ever, right? That kind of okay. But me, I was saying I'm out and I'm proud of being gay. That meant in my father's eyes, you are going to get AIDS, right?
Right, absolutely. And but even with our own community, we felt that, it was inevitable that we were going to get this. We felt, none of us in those days thought we were going to live to be 30. Right. I mean, we thought we were not going to live a full life. Just because of the unknown, because everyone we knew was dying. When you go to, 3 funerals a week, it's hard when you're in your 20s, it's kind of hard to imagine a future when all of your friends are all dying. And so it was a difficult time, but that living multiple lives, persists in the South and in small town. It's not just a Southern thing. It is
it's a rural thing.
It's a rural issue in many cases, but certainly perpetuated by religion and so often. I was married. I had 3 children. I have 3 children. They didn't disappear. I still have 3 children.
Yeah. He
And
says
I
good.
have 6 grandchildren. But at the time, when I was married, it was very common for there to be married married gay men who were not at all monogamous, but were still having sex with other gay men
Yeah.
that were married, because they were, and in some cases, in my case, my wife knew before we got married that I was gay. So that wasn't a surprise to her. But many men that I knew, that was not the situation. They were
Yeah.
living an alternate life, which endangered not only themselves, but their spouses, and the from a health standpoint. But
Mhm.
it's just living that sort of a lie just to fit in with your community. It is just obscene, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so, but it was perpetuated by religion, but also a great deal of an example. When in the South, you're very familiar. When I grew up, I remember when I was a senior in high school that I was going to have a senior party at my house. I lived in a almost 100% white community. I had 2 African-American friends who in my class who were both cousins, and my mother came to me and said, "I just want you to know they can't come to your party." And well, why? My mother wasn't at all racist. And the reality is she feared the Klan burning our house down.
God.
So there was a great deal of peer pressure to fit in to what your neighbors, who were always watching in a small town,
Mhm.
wanted you to be.
Mhm.
So it grew. I think it grew out of that. And so when I see when people say, well, the civil rights fight is a common denominator, it is absolutely, because the same prejudices and the same hate that was directed toward our African American brothers and sisters certainly was perpetuated against us.
Right.
It was against Jewish, Hispanics, Irish at one point,
Yeah.
Catholics at one
Mhm.
point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me.
It's very real. It's very that. And I think it's funny to me, or I don't know, not funny is not the right word, but there's something strange there about the way that this sort of translated through the generations. Because as a kid, I was born in 85, right? I did not live through the AIDS epidemic, but I had, because of the weight of the AIDS epidemic in news and media, in my church, in the way my family perceived gay people, I also lived with that feeling that I wouldn't make it to 30.
Right.
Um, and that, I don't know if kids these days have that same kind of, you know, fear that being gay means you're going to burn hot and burn out quickly, right? But that's hearing you say that and thinking, I can't believe I felt that too, and I didn't even go through what you did. Is
Right.
it's age is a generational trauma, right?
It is absolutely. And just like, the children children who were beaten as a child grow up to be abusive parents, often the case. It's sort of the same sort of thing. It's like, your homophobia and racism was learned from somewhere. It came from your parents, who
Mm.
learned it from their grandparents, and so on and so forth. We are our own worst enemies when it comes to, taking a look at the reality of things and making a difference in changing something.
Yeah, yeah, that's really something. I we live now in an age, thank God, where AIDS isn't a death sentence anymore. And
Right.
the drugs are so much better now, and we've got preventables like PrEP that can be taken. For those who don't know, PrEP is a medication that you can take before exposure to HIV that can
Right.
greatly decrease your risk of getting HIV. Um, but now I think because of this, there's a view now among the younger generations and Gen Z that they're ready to move on from talking about the AIDS epidemic, right?
Right.
Uh, why is it important for us to keep these conversations about the history of the epidemic alive and actively taught in schools and that kind of thing? Why do we need to keep talking about this?
Well, I think that any community that doesn't know where we've been has no idea where we're going. So I
Mm,
think it's important not only to know what colors the view of our world today, what makes us, act a certain way or think a certain way. I think if that's important, but greater than that, I think that it's important for young people to understand that this isn't ancient history. It was just recently.
yeah, right.
It was a very recent thing. And so we need to understand that just as we saw with when COVID raised its ugly head, which for many in our community, those of us who lived through the AIDS epidemic, was shocking and had real deja vu, lots of deja vu moments. Like, here we are again. Our friends are dying. The government didn't have a handle on it.
Mhm.
It's a virus. It can't really be wiped out.
Yeah,
And so there were so many deja vu moments. And so it's important that it's not just the response to the AIDS epidemic was not just medical, but it was social, it was emotional. And so whether it be another AIDS pandemic, an AIDS epidemic, a new strain of AIDS that
mm,
breaks forth, or the next virus that is not sexually transmitted.
right.
It is real, and we saw some of the same hysteria during the COVID pandemic that we did during when AIDS was first rearing its ugly head. The same fear, the same paranoia, the same finger pointing, and the same demonization. Well, you
Right.
deserve that.
Mm,
Um, and so
yeah.
we have to learn from that. And it's not just, this isn't just a gay issue. It is a social issue in our world. And so we need to realize that and hopefully learn something from one to the next, which we are terrible at doing.
Yeah, right. I mean, and now the statistics show that, the number one population with HIV today is heterosexual women. And, they're the AIDS virus is not it's not dead, right? And that's
No,
part of the
not at all.
reason we have to keep talking about it, is because if we don't, you're going to think that you've just out of nowhere contracted this virus that might as well be as foreign to you as the bubonic plague, right? We have to
Correct.
talk about this. And, in places like Africa, it's going to be much, much more difficult to wipe out the AIDS virus, even if someday we do get a vaccine. Um,
Well, and but you have to wipe out the ignorance before you can wipe out the
that's it.
disease.
Yeah.
You have to control it. I mean, I would venture to say that the people who lined up first to get their vaccines to COVID were members of our community, because we were clamoring for a vaccine
Yeah.
for AIDS. Give me one. You know, so my biggest fear is that young people tend to have looked at AIDS as a manageable disease. So
Mhm.
what if I get it? And that's not always true.
Yeah.
And as the virus, you know, different people react to it differently. And in addition to that, the same safe sex attitudes that we adopted to keep us alive, have been almost completely abandoned by young people.
That's true.
And there are many more diseases out there besides AIDS that
Yeah.
could be much more hazardous to your health
Yeah.
than something that can be managed like AIDS. So it's important for us to remember that while Larry Kramer may have said abstinence is the only way, we learned the reality of it is that safer sex attitudes and processes can save lives. And so I think it's important that young people understand that, and that we want them to be around, to
It's
tell
true.
the stories,
It's true.
tell our stories.
Yeah.
But it's important they understand there is an option.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think because so many of us receive, I'm someone who went to a school where we got abstinence only sex education in school. That it's
You at
important
least
to
got an
folks.
education in the 70s when I was in high school. Not so much.
Yeah,
Not so much.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was very, I there in the movie Mean Girls, there's the bit about the sex education where the guy says, "Here it is. If you have sex, you're gonna get herpes and die, right? You're gonna get pregnant and then die. Maybe not in that order, but at the same time, or But that's very true to what my sex education was like, But I think it is important to still preach safe sex because there is more out there than just
Right.
HIV, and those can have a real impact on your life. And yes, a lot of it is treatable, but why take the risk if you don't have to?
Right. I mean, you need we young people need to understand. I mean, young people. I mean, I remember when they first started preaching that we need to wear condoms. We're like, well, we're not going to do that.
Yeah,
What do you mean wear a condom?
yeah,
But it kept us alive, and it kept
yeah,
us alive. And young people today have the same difficulty embracing condoms as we did. And I'm sure just as, my father's generation was, I'm not going to wear a condom, but it's important. It is
it is
important. And so,
important. It is important. I
and
mean,
young people need to understand that, you can live a full, happy, sexually active life if you follow some simple guidelines to keep you and your partner safe.
right, right, and trying to method this worked for me is monogamy. I've been with my husband for 15 years now, and it's just just the two of us. So that's not for everybody, but for us it works. Um, yeah, I in the mid 2000s when I was in college, there was a real concerted effort to give out condoms at every opportunity at pride parades and at stuff like that. I used to work as a visual for you. I used to work at a gay bar as a shot boy where I'd walk around with an ammo belt filled with Jello shots, and it was my take at the time to anytime I would sell somebody one of these shots, they would also get a free condom. Right? That was me trying to do my part.
Well, we used to host, we would do lots of, fundraising benefits and shows to raise money for, for the AIDS organizations primarily. And every single show would also include a safer sex demonstration. Here's how you use a condom. Here's how you use it. Roll it down a banana or whatever,
Yeah,
So we were, that was part of our lives.
yeah,
And so we would go out and we would pass out condoms. And so it was every bar had a jar of condoms by the register. There
yeah,
was a
yeah,
tip bucket and there was a condom jar.
yeah.
And that was just the reality of it. So but yes, it was, and that effort was not something that we were funded for to do. We just did it
Right.
because it was important, and we worked at the AIDS hospice, and we spent time assisting, taking care of our brothers who were dying. And so we saw that we need to do something. And so it was the way of the world.
That's it. And it's so important still today to talk about safe sex because of these efforts to curtail sex education in schools. So it's our job as citizens and family members of these young people to do the education ourselves and at least give them the proper resources they can go to online and it's no different than the way that we communicate LGBTQ plus history because we still have a way to go before LGBTQ history is normal to be taught in high schools.
Right.
There are some states that allow it. happy to say we know and love Zaylor Stout, who wrote the only nationally recognized book of LGBTQ plus history that's used as high school curriculum, called The 50 Gay States of America. And that book is available on Amazon. We've had Zaylor Stout here at eXp for events before, but that's not the norm, right? So when it
Not
comes
at
to
all.
queer history, it really is. There's an oral tradition of passing this stuff down, and I hope that everybody that is listening to this, if you know someone who's LGBTQ, and particularly if they're an LGBTQ elder, we hold those people in very high regard in our community, because they're our storytellers. They're the people who pass down these legends and stories in ways that film and TV, quite frankly, rarely get right. You know,
Right.
um,
Absolutely.
so
And,
that
and there
those are
are
the kind of people.
resources out there, and there are resources out there that are palatable and viewable by young people, to help them understand.
Yeah.
And it's not just one of the organizations, I think, that has done the best job about bridging this divide, or this gap of understanding, um, was PFLAG.
Hmm.
PFLAG, what in many communities is still hugely important, because, as a parent of a gay or lesbian child, you need a resource. Well, who do I talk to? What do I need to know? What do you I would get calls because my phone number was listed for our nonprofit, for the Names Project. And so I get calls sometimes from, a mother who would say, "Hey, my son just came out to me as gay. What do I need to know?
Hmm.
What should I ask him?" And so oftentimes I wasn't a trained, therapist. I was just some guy who would answer the phone and try to answer questions for these mothers and our fathers or brothers or sisters, who have questions. And so PFLAG is huge in that regard, in helping, especially in smaller communities with not a lot of other resources. They can be there to be that resource and help pull things together. So there's still a great need for all of these. Unfortunately, in the world of everything is on a social media now, or everything is in an app or whatever, young people are not as involved in joining organizations. They are not necessarily interested in being a member of an organization or a particular supporter of an organization.
Hmm.
But those organizations are vitally important as resources for not only our history, but also resources for parents and others who have questions. And it makes their lives better. It makes their parents' lives better by getting answers and not listening to some talking head on a news program with a political ideal to push. So
Hmm.
so those are vitally important. And so in every community there are organizations that people can join. And I wish we could somehow encourage young people to seek these out, and to get information, but also join and lend your effort to this ongoing education process.
It's so huge, and there's a lot that you can do to educate yourself and get yourself involved with your local uh, queer communities. Some of us in rural areas, like here in Danville, we don't have a local LGBT organization, but just one town over in Champaign, they do.
Right.
And if you find that organization, often they have a list of resources on their website that you can go to for local resources if you've got a teen. Um, in my job here at EXP, I get these kind of calls
Right.
frequently. My son, my brother, my daughter just came out as queer or trans or any of those things, and what do I do next, right? Um, and I'm happy to be a resource and happy to pass along to more educated resources. I often tell folks about, many people don't know that we now have a 3-digit phone number that you can call in a mental health crisis. 988. You can dial anywhere from where you can dial 911. That's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline and mental health service for the United States. They can help. For
Right.
LGBTQ issues, I often send folks to the Trevor Project.
Right.
That's a great resource you can use. And if you want to learn more about LGBTQ history, there's there's a lot of places you can go. One of my very favorites that we feature quite prominently in the Pride History Experience in eXp world is the Making Gay History podcast, which is a podcast hosted by Eric Marcus, who sat down and did interviews with folks who he thought may be significant in the future back in those times. So you can hear from the Sylvia Riveras and the Marsha P. Johnsons and the Cleve Joneses in their own voices during the moments of history where they were active. That podcast is brilliant. It's beautiful. It talks about the plight of the LGBTQ person, and also the joy that comes with the coming out of the closet process.
Right.
It has been such a joy to have you here, Gene. I'm so glad we were able to speak. If anybody has any questions or comments, you can always reach us at dei@exprealty.net. You can find us on Workplace. Thank you for listening to the podcast. We will see you next time.